Hello everybody, welcome to another video. Today is the 9th of May, and today I will be talking about the general front line because I haven't really been able to cover a lot of different sectors because I've really been focusing on Bakhmut and the situation between the Russian Ministry of Defense and Yevgeny Prigozhin. And so today I'm going to be trying to talk a bit about the changes to the front line that have occurred elsewhere. So let's begin with Marinka. And in Marinka, if you remember, the main dividing line between the Russian and Ukrainian forces was Druzhby Avenue. Now, in all honesty, Druzhby Avenue isn't much different than any other road that runs like vertically over here. Like you see all these other roads, they're pretty much the same. The only difference is that Druzhby Avenue, it held significance before the war as the dividing line between the eastern and western parts of the city, and it was basically the center of the town. We had a lot of larger structures in that area, and so that's where a lot of the fighting has been occurring over the past few months in the government buildings and some different facilities. And so now the Russians have been able to, first of all, fully take over the parts of Marinka to the east of Druzhby Avenue, and they've been able to cross Druzhby Avenue, and they've done this especially from the south, where they took over different farm enterprises in this entire facility, and now they have a good position to flank the Ukrainian forces that are part of the 79th Air Assault Brigade from the south, and they also have positions to the north of the main urban cluster of Marinka because they were able to cross Druzhby Avenue and take over some positions in the northern suburbs. So now you can see how a pincer operation is forming, and this could lead to the end of the Marinka resistance after many months of war. And I think this is going to take still months to finally be taken by the Russians, given the current pace of their advances, which have been a little to none, honestly. But yeah, in recent days, we saw that the Russians were able to cross Druzhby Avenue in the city center and take over the first few blocks directly to the west of it. And so that's the latest news in that regard. But for the most part, Ukraine is holding their own over here. The city itself, or whatever you want to call it, town, it had like a pre-war population of 15,000, if I recall correctly. It is just totally ravaged. Every single house is impacted in some way by the artillery. You can still see the structure and the skeleton of the houses, and so in some regard it could still be used to hide as a concealment or cover, but it's not anything normal. Any sort of reinvigoration of the town is going to be extremely difficult, especially given the current circumstances. And then to the north, really nothing new, just Russians continuing to hold their current firing positions in the northern outskirts and some warehouses. If we go up, try to see where else there were updates, and we have actually a lot of interesting news coming from the Donbass water canal and the area around Stupochki, and many other of these towns are adjacent to the water canal. So if we go back in time a few months, we know that the Wagner Group, they began expanding their sphere of control across this water canal because the canal is over here, outlined in red. So you can see they were able to take over positions that included forested areas, it included quarries, it included some open fields and bush lines and tree lines. And so they took over a pretty sizable chunk of land that could be used to, first of all, cut off the T-0504 road and cross over and take over the southern flank of Chasiv Yar. Now this is no longer possible due to Ukrainian counterattack in this area. And it also has to do with the fact that, as we've been saying for a while, Wagner's been concentrating the bulk of their forces within the city of Bakhmut itself, the urban center, and not its flanks. And this is one of Prigozhin's main concerns that he's been publicly talking about. A lot of people would like to call it a psyop, but at least in this specific regard, in terms of the flanks, it's undeniable that, first of all, Wagner's moved their troops out of the northern and southern flanks to focus on the city of Bakhmut itself. It's also undeniable to look at the front line and see how the Ukrainians have been recently pushing back the Russians on the southern flank. Now, it's also possible that the Russians are doing this voluntarily because it is difficult to hold positions across the canal because it's so far away from Russia's main logistics and their main supply lines, so they may just want to set up defensive positions across the canal. But then again, if this is the case, then it means it's going to be much more difficult for the Russians later on to cross the canal and then try to retake their lost positions after they've already been recaptured and refortified with the Ukrainians. And Ukrainians have a pretty sizable garrison in this area. There's an actual, a full tactical group of Ukrainian forces in this area around the water canal, which I guess extends from around Ozaryanivka to this forested area over here. And it's called Tactical Group Azov. And so it's not really made up of the original Azov cast that fought and died and got released later on from Mariupol. It's a lot of newer branches that got instituted throughout the course of the war. And so now these units, including the 3rd Assault Brigade, they're conducting offensive activity. Here we actually have a video that was released by the 3rd Assault Brigade where it shows how they were able to counterattack near the canal. And so we know that it's not just a Russian voluntary retreat, although I'm sure that the Russians did eventually decide that they had to retreat in a specific area because they saw how it was not feasible to defend it. There was certainly some Ukrainian assaults involved in their decision. And so I've seen some Ukrainian claims that they've been able to retake about 8 square kilometers of land in this general area, where you have some paved or unpaved paths, some dirt roads, like you see this one over here, which connects to the T054 road. There's like a bridge that goes across it and then goes into the Chasiv Yar area. There's also a lot of different forest belts and tree lines and open fields. So it's a good area to set up trenches. And so in that regard, it could favor the defenders, but also it's good for mechanized assaults. So we've seen some videos being released by the 3rd Separate Assault Brigade, they basically show how they were able to utilize some of their older tanks, some of their infantry fighting vehicles to push back the Russian infantry across the canal, and how they utilized drones to strike their trenches. Nothing really new. It's just that the Russians weren't able to offer up as much resistance because, again, they're so far away from the main logistics hubs because they're across the canal. And because, again, there's less of an emphasis on this area, as Prigozhin was complaining about. And what was supposed to happen is that Wagner would focus on Bakhmut, and that the Russian regular army, or at least the VDVs, because I know a lot of people have been saying in the comments that the VDVs are responsible for defending the flanks. And that's true to a certain extent. It's not all VDVs that are defending the northern and southern flanks. And the VDVs, they're the paratroopers. There are some other units involved, like DPR and LPR units. And I'm going to get into this now. But according to Prigozhin, there is a 72nd Separate Motorized Rifle Brigade, which was involved in this Russian retreat from their positions across the water canal. And so before this announcement by Prigozhin, I've never heard before of the 72nd Separate Motorized Rifle Brigade, which Prigozhin alleges is a unit within the Russian army, which was defending the forward positions in this area, but got badly defeated by the Ukrainians and suffered 500 casualties. This is according to Prigozhin himself. Now, 500, that seems like way too much. Even according to the 3rd Separate Assault Brigade, they say that they killed dozens of Russian forces. And in the videos, you could see how many were killed. It's not 500, at least according to their footage. Maybe it's like under 100, maximum 100 in the past few days. Not 500, that's a crazy number. But this is again confirmed by the 3rd Assault Brigade that there has been a Russian retreat in this area. And they also say that the 72nd Brigade was the unit that they destroyed and forced a retreat. And so I've never heard before of 72nd Separate Motorized Rifle Brigade. And I did some research about it. And it apparently is a new unit that was formed last year in the summer. And this was a part of the 3rd Army Corps. If you remember that, the 3rd Army Corps, it was getting hyped up as this new unit that the Russians could utilize, this massive force that could be sent to supplement one of the fronts, like the Donetsk front or the Zaporozhye or some front, whatever it may be. And it was estimated that about 20 to 30,000 men in the Army Corps. I have no idea if that's true. It seems to me like their numbers got inflated, and their amount of experience and the amount of equipment they had, it all got inflated, and that in reality it was just the integration of several new brigades and battalions into the front line, and so they just got eventually absorbed into whatever respective sector they were in, and it didn't really do much to supplement the original forces. It's just like, just your standard reinforcements, but nothing over the top. And so it seems like the 72nd Brigade, it's one of these volunteer units that was formed. Apparently it was formed in Orenburg Oblast, and it had at least 120 recruits from neighboring oblast that was adjacent to Orenburg Oblast. And that's the most that we have about their personnel. We don't really have much else about how many they had from Orenburg Oblast, but if it's a brigade, you'd assume that there would be more than 120. But that's what I'm saying. A lot of these numbers, they get inflated, and they're just people on paper. They're not actually men being sent to war. It's more of like a paper brigade, but in reality, it turns out to be a battalion. And so it seems like it's possible that there was this volunteer unit from the 3rd Army Corps that was manning the front line, because Prigozhin was requesting help on the flanks, and this was what Russia could muster to send to the flanks. And if that's the case, then clearly these defenders were not, or you could say even they were supposed to be attacking in some instances, but at least these Russian forces that were on the flanks, they weren't doing a sufficient job at holding the front line, and so they just decided that it's easier to just shorten the front line, set up fortified positions across the water canal, and leave it as it is. And so using that logic, we could also assume that at some point the Ukrainians will also be able to retake the rest of the land that Russia has across the water canal, and they have, you see this polygon over here that I'm outlining, and so you could probably expect the Ukrainians to take it back at some point if the current trends continue. Now within Bakhmut itself, there's really not much to go over because the fighting has really stagnated. There's a lot of very fierce clashes going on around this post office over here. This is where Ukrainians are trying to hold out for as long as possible. And there's also a lot of fighting going on in the Olympic school facility, which includes all of this area. And so again, you're seeing it more so in the northern part of this northwestern corner around some of the forested areas. And at the same time, the Ukrainians are building up their defenses around this garage area over here. And this garage, it sort of like spans the entire northwestern corner of this entire garage complex. And so it could be used as an effective line of final defense before the Russians are able to flank the citadel from the north. And then in terms of the citadel itself, no real frontal assaults by the Russians, which makes a lot of sense because nobody wants to go into their guns blazing. We actually do have a video that I have linked here of a Ukrainian withdrawal from the road that I talked about before. It's very difficult to pronounce. Vyzhvo, Liteliv, Donbass streets. And so the Ukrainians, presumably they had positions in these apartment buildings to the north of that street over here. In the video you could see the drone footage, and you could see how one of the apartment buildings, pretty sure it's 97, is partially destroyed to such an extent that I haven't really seen from any of the other apartment buildings in the area. And then that the Ukrainians, they're just jumping out of windows from the lower floors and quickly making their retreat across Donbass streets to the citadel area. And so yeah, that just indicates that they have begun to coalesce around this one last stronghold. But again, I will say the rate of advance has been very slow in recent days. We'll see if that changes once the Akhmat Special Forces make their way. But again, I do believe that if Prigozhin is serious about preserving manpower, and it's possible that he lost a lot of men in this pursuit of taking over Bakhmut, and so he wants to try to preserve his manpower now, not expend any more men unnecessarily in the final stretch. And so there is a possibility that they may be waiting out and will continue to advance at a faster pace once the Akhmat forces arrive. Speaking of the flanks of the Bakhmut front, it's not really on the flanks, but it's to the north of Bakhmut. There was a reported Ukrainian counterattack, or at least the beginning of offensive activities around the Vasyukivka River, with the Ukrainians pushing towards Sako and Venzeti, which is a pretty cool town name based on some Italian Americans that were executed in the U.S. It's probably named that way during the Soviet times. But this town is still under the Russian control, but we just know that there was some Ukrainian activity in that direction, and it is possible that they could be able to take it back because Sakon Vinseti, it is across the Vasyukivka River, so it is again sort of isolated from the main Russian lines. And so are a lot of these other towns like Mykolaiivka, where we haven't really seen much of a Russian push in recent months because they've been focusing so much on the urban city of Bakhmut during that time. Now, before I end the video, last thing is that Ukraine, they apparently took over some open fields and some ditches just to the south of Vilshana. And so roughly, this is the polygon that they took over. It's not that significant, again, because these are just minor changes, but it does show that they at least pushed towards the outskirts of Vilshana, took over some ditches that could be used as defensive positions by the Russians, and they have been now taken by the Ukrainians. So, yeah, that's it for today. Thank you guys a lot for watching, and I'll see you guys later. Goodbye.